They thought my company was a failure until they saw me in Forbes. They planned an ambush dinner, like it was some kind of intervention. My dad called it a serious conversation about my future, but the way he said it, all grim and commanding, made it clear it wasn't going to be pleasant. I already knew something was off from the way my mom had texted me earlier, short, stiff, and suspiciously polite. The moment I walked into the dining room and saw my dad in his starched white shirt, arms crossed like he was presiding over a courtroom, my mom already setting down a roast like we were playing pretend family, and my sister Miranda with her ever-present file folder and that smug, "I'm here to fix your life" expression, I knew exactly what was coming. It started with pleasantries, fake laughter, the usual house business, while my dad barely kept the sarcasm out of his voice. Then Miranda leaned forward with that lawyerly look she probably practiced in the mirror. "Vanessa," she said, like she was about to deliver a sentencing, "we've been talking, and we're worried about you." That was the cue for my dad to launch into a monologue about responsibility, financial sustainability, reality, and how startups rarely survive past the first year. His voice was so controlled, so certain, like he was delivering gospel, not opinion. My mom nodded quietly, eyes flicking between my face and her untouched wine glass. I waited. I let them talk. Let them build up steam. I even let Miranda slide that folder across the table with the alternative career options she'd thoughtfully printed out. It had articles with headlines like, "When to walk away from a failed business," and 10 signs it's time to pivot. My dad was already on to his second glass of scotch, getting comfortable in his judgment. My mom avoided eye contact, and Miranda was just about to ask if I'd considered law school again when I reached into my tote and pulled out the latest issue of Forbes. I didn't say a word. I just laid it on the table and let the glossy page speak for itself. My face, full color, standing in front of the Next Layer logo, captioned, "Vanessa Brooks, 30, on reshaping cybersecurity for the next decade." I watched the shift happen in real time. My mom blinked like she'd misread it. Miranda's lips parted, then closed. My dad picked it up, stared, adjusted his glasses, stared again. Nobody spoke. I finally did. "The company you think is failing? We just closed our Series B at $18 million valuation. That folder you brought? You can throw it out." The silence that followed was so thick it felt physical. I looked each of them in the eye, let it sink in. My dad cleared his throat. "Why didn't you tell us?" Like it was my fault they underestimated me. Miranda had the decency to look mildly ashamed. My mom finally spoke, soft and shaken. "I had no idea." "Exactly," I said, standing up. "You never asked." I left them there, speechless, Forbes still open on the table, their perfect little dinner ruined by the reality they never bothered to see. Growing up in Seattle felt like living in a catalog for conventional success, and my family was the glossy cover. We lived in a 2-story colonial with navy shutters and a perfectly trimmed hedge that my mom maintained with almost militant precision. My dad wore suits even on Saturdays, as if he feared someone might catch him in jeans and mistake him for someone less serious. He worked in finance, of course, because in my family, numbers were sacred and risk was blasphemy. Amanda, my older sister by 4 years, fit into this world like she'd been born holding a resume. Amanda was the golden child, the perfect prototype. She got straight as without trying, volunteered for things just to round out her college applications, and somehow managed to get into Stanford without so much as a whisper of rebellion. I still remember the day her acceptance letter came. How my parents threw a dinner party with white wine and catered finger foods, how my mom cried like Amanda had been crowned royalty. There was a banner on the dining room wall that read, "So proud of you," in gold script, and I remember standing next to the cheese platter feeling like a party crasher at my own family celebration. Meanwhile, I was the weird one, the quiet one, the one who preferred taking apart old laptops from garage sales instead of joining the tennis team or signing up for Model UN. I built things, obsessively, robot arms from broken appliances, security systems from thrift store parts, a makeshift server from an abandoned desktop I'd salvaged from the curb. But to my family, it was always Vanessa's little projects, never anything real. My mom once told her book club that I was artsy with computers, whatever that meant. Amanda was the benchmark, the measuring stick by which everything else, including me, was judged, and I never quite cleared the bar. Every time I showed interest in something, it was greeted with caution. I remember mentioning I wanted to learn coding in middle school, and my dad responded by asking if it would interfere with my math grades. I taught myself Python anyway, working late into the night while my parents thought I was watching Netflix. I built a website at 14 to sell password-protected encrypted storage keys, completely legal, by the way, and my mom told me to take it down because it looked sketchy. Amanda joined the debate team and was applauded for her articulation. I built a functioning motion sensor light system for the backyard and got grounded because I'd borrowed some tools without asking. There was this unspoken rule in our house. Amanda's path was the ideal, and anything that deviated from it was risky, strange, or immature. My room looked like a tech scrapyard: circuit boards, wires, energy drink cans, stacks of tech magazines, and they never saw it as ambition. Just mess. Just noise. Amanda's room, pristine and color-coded, got featured in some online lifestyle blog once. Mine got the door shut whenever guests came over. It didn't help that Amanda loved her role. She wasn't cruel, but she was smug in that way people get when they've never failed at anything. She spoke to me like I was a child who hadn't figured out how the world worked yet. Stability matters, Vanessa, she'd say. You can't live off ideas. Except I didn't want stability. I wanted challenge, complexity, freedom. I didn't care about gold stars or impressive titles. I cared about solving problems no one else was looking at. But in our family, wanting more than a pension and a business card was borderline rebellion. Even the way they spoke about me to other people felt like a microaggression dressed as a compliment. Amanda's our lawyer. She works at a firm downtown. They'd say proudly, then glance at me and add, Vanessa's really into tech stuff. She's very creative. Creative, in our family, was just a polite way of saying impractical. It was maddening. No matter how much I built, achieved, invented, nothing ever seemed to count unless it came with a credential they could name drop at dinner parties. So I stopped trying to explain myself. I poured myself into my work, quietly building what would eventually become next layer from the pieces they never thought would fit together. And the irony? The same people who once rolled their eyes at my projects now hand out my business cards like trophies. But I remember who they were when I was in their shadow. I remember every dismissive glance, every condescending smile, every time they chose stability over belief in me. And I never forget how many times I had to prove myself before they even started asking questions. Getting into the University of Miami's entrepreneurship program felt like my first real act of defiance, even though I didn't frame it that way at the time. My parents wanted me closer to home, preferably in Seattle, ideally at some stable, sensible school with a name that came with gravitas. My dad floated the idea of Northwestern more than once, something about proximity to Amanda, something about alumni networks, something about real degrees. But I didn't want gravitas. I wanted sun, speed, sweat, chaos. I wanted to build something on my own terms, without someone watching over my shoulder and telling me to stay inside the lines. Miami was that chance. Far enough that they couldn't drop by for surprise visits. Close enough that I could still call if everything collapsed, which they expected it would. Orientation week felt like freedom dressed in palm trees and sweat. I showed up with a battered laptop, a duffel bag full of wires and cables, and this itch I couldn't scratch until I was making something, anything, again. The entrepreneurship program wasn't flashy. It wasn't packed with future CEOs in blazers or tech bros pitching vaporware over smoothies. It was just weird enough to feel like home. Most of my classmates had failed at something before they even got to college. One guy had tried to import bamboo cutlery and lost $6,000. A girl I became close with had built a niche clothing brand out of recycled wetsuits. They were all brilliant in that broken, patched-together kind of way, and I loved it. By sophomore year, I realized I couldn't wait around for someone else to create the kind of space I needed, so I started one myself. It was just 3 of us in a dorm common room at first, hacking ideas out on whiteboards and arguing about valuations we couldn't begin to justify. I called it the Startup Club, not because it was clever, but because it was blunt. The name stuck. By the end of the semester, we had 15 members, weekly meetings, and 2 pitch nights that drew real local investors, one of whom actually offered seed funding to a member's app. That kind of thing didn't happen at our school. We weren't Stanford. We weren't even close. But we were hungry. During all this, my dad kept emailing articles about the economy, usually with subject lines like, just something to think about, or safety nets matter. I knew what he meant. His offer was always sitting there, quiet and conditional. Join his firm, work in finance, get serious, as he liked to say. He never said it outright, but every conversation with him felt like a long pitch for a life I didn't want. A corner office in a building that smelled like old money. A pension. A nameplate. An existence that looked great in photos and felt like drowning in molasses. I graduated with a degree, a pile of student debt, and a small army of LinkedIn connections, most of whom had no idea I was still debugging a prototype backend in my apartment at 3 a.m. My dad took me to dinner that night, some overpriced steakhouse he always picked for moments he wanted to feel powerful. He didn't even wait until the appetizers. You can start in August, he said, sliding a business card across the table like it was an invitation to salvation. You'll have a salary, health benefits, a clear path. He looked proud, certain I'd say yes. I slid the card back across the table without touching it. I already accepted another job, I said. Small cybersecurity firm in Little Haiti. 8 people total. No benefits yet, but they're building something I actually believe in. He didn't say anything for a while. Just stared at me like I dropped out of college on purpose to join a cult. Then he gave that tight-lipped nod he always used when he thought I was being stupid, but didn't want to argue in public. The truth was, I needed that job like I needed air. It wasn't glamorous. The office was half a loft above a laundromat. The Wi-Fi cut out when it rained, and I had to bring my own chair the first week. But it was mine. I got to touch everything: code, product, strategy, even customer service when someone's firewall settings bricked the whole platform. I learned more in 6 months there than I would have in 6 years at my dad's firm. I was broke, exhausted, eating dollar store ramen with hot sauce because that was all I could afford, but for the first time, I wasn't living in Amanda's shadow or my father's expectation. I was building something real. I was finally free. I started Next Layer in a shared co-working space with cracked windows, mismatched chairs, and coffee that tasted like regret, but it was mine, and that was enough. I had $12,000 to my name. Savings I'd scraped together over the years from freelance gigs, college side hustles, and saying no to every night out that didn't double as a networking opportunity. No investors, no seed round, no one whispering strategy tips over wine in Palo Alto. Just me, a refurbished Dell, and an idea I couldn't shake. Make cybersecurity tools that didn't treat small businesses like afterthoughts. It started with a single client, a guy who ran a used car dealership and had been hacked twice in 6 months. He paid me in 3 checks and a basket of peaches from his backyard tree. I rebuilt his system from scratch, patched holes, set up a simple firewall with remote monitoring, and walked him through how to avoid phishing attacks without sounding like a tech bro with a superiority complex. Word got around. My phone started ringing. Hair salons, mom-and-pop bakeries, a local nonprofit that stored donor info in unsecured spreadsheets. They didn't need jargon. They needed help. Real help. Help that didn't come with a 5-figure quote or expect them to already understand what a zero-day exploit was. I didn't even tell my parents about the business at first. I knew what they'd say. I knew because they'd said it about every decision I'd made that didn't come with a title or a defined salary. But eventually it slipped out during a dinner my mother insisted I attend because Amanda will be there and she wants to catch up. I mentioned I'd started a company, a cybersecurity service for small businesses. My mom blinked politely. Amanda asked if I had a legal structure in place. My dad leaned back in his chair and said, "This isn't a business, Vanessa. It's a phase." That line stuck with me longer than I care to admit. The way he said it, calm, certain, like it was just fact, made me feel 15 again, standing in the hallway with a robotics trophy they never came to see me win. Amanda laughed the way people do when they think they're being generous. "Just make sure you keep your receipts," she said, like my biggest risk was bad bookkeeping. What they didn't see was the 4 a.m. crash outs at my desk after debugging code all night. They didn't see the handwritten proposals, the free workshops I hosted at libraries to teach small business owners the basics of cybersecurity hygiene, or the hours I spent Googling how to write contracts that wouldn't get me sued. They didn't see the silent panic of watching my bank account dip below $500 and wondering if I'd made the dumbest mistake of my life. But I saw it. I saw the growth. I saw the trust in my clients' eyes when I explained things without condescension, when I made them feel safe in a world they didn't understand. I saw the emails that said, "I slept better after talking to you," and the ones that started with, "Hey, my friend said you helped him with his system. Can you take a look at ours?" I didn't need their belief. I just needed a firewall that worked, a client that paid on time, and one more day to prove them wrong. And every time I wanted to quit, I'd hear my dad's voice echoing in my head. "This isn't a business, it's a phase," and I'd smile. Because even then, I knew I wasn't building a phase. I was building something they could never control, never belittle, and eventually, never ignore. The first few months after launching Next Layer were a kind of brutal that I wasn't prepared for. Not the romanticized, gritty kind of struggle they write about in startup memoirs with heroic montages and eventual IPOs, but the slow, humiliating crawl of living off instant noodles and microwaved rice, wondering if today would be the day I finally couldn't afford rent or Wi-Fi. I was working out of the corner of my tiny apartment, a place where the AC barely worked and the ceiling creaked like it was trying to quit. 16-hour days blurred into one another. I coded until my eyes burned, answered emails like they were landmines, and pitched to clients with a desperation I couldn't hide no matter how steady my voice sounded on calls. Every time I opened my mouth to talk about the business around my family, I could feel the walls go up. My dad never brought it up directly again, but he'd ask things like, "So, are you still doing that computer thing?" Like he was trying to remember whether I was playing with a hobby or running a lemonade stand. Amanda once called it boutique tech, which made me want to flip the table we were sitting at. And my mom, bless her carefully veiled contempt, always knew exactly when to drop her little bombs. You should try getting your resume back out there, just in case, she'd say with the warm smile of someone setting fire to your lifeboat while complimenting your paddling form. But nothing compared to the day I lost my first big client. It was a mid-sized e-commerce site I'd spent weeks securing, auditing their systems, building out a custom package that I thought would lock them in long-term. They ghosted me after 3 months, just stopped responding, stopped paying, and eventually sent a 2-sentence email saying they were moving in another direction. That direction turned out to be a cheaper offshore option with no customer support and a nice logo. I sat on my floor for an hour after that, back against the wall, laptop in my lap, not even crying, just hollow, like someone had carved me out and left me there to dry. That same evening, my mom called. Not to check on me. She never did that unprompted, but to ask if I could help her with a spreadsheet issue. I told her I'd had a rough day, that I'd lost a major client and might not make it to the end of the quarter. There was a pause on the line, just long enough to give me a flicker of hope that she'd say something comforting. Instead, she sighed and said, "Maybe it's time to admit defeat, Vanessa. This doesn't have to be your life. You could still do something normal, something stable." I don't remember what I said back. Probably nothing. But I do remember closing my laptop, standing in that hot, silent room, and knowing with absolute certainty that if I didn't figure something out right then, it would all be over. So I stopped waiting for the next client and started thinking like the people I built NextLayer for. Small businesses weren't just losing data. They were losing time, sleep, trust. They didn't need bloated custom audits they couldn't afford. They needed fast, clean, easy-to-use tools that made them feel safe without making them feel stupid. I tore apart everything I'd built and started over from the ground up. I created a modular security toolkit, plug-and-play setups that adapted to business size, risk level, and budget. No contracts, no buzzwords, just real protection, fast onboarding, and human-level support. I tested it on a few local shops, watched how they used it, changed the interface a dozen times, slept maybe 10 hours that whole week. But when I demoed it the second time, they didn't just nod along. They asked how fast they could start. I never told my mom that moment was the turning point, because it wouldn't have mattered to her. But I remember exactly where I was sitting when I launched the first version of the new model. On my kitchen floor, laptop balanced on a shoebox, hands shaking from too much caffeine and not enough sleep. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't losing. I was changing the game. The breakthrough didn't come with fanfare or applause. It came at 2:43 a.m. on a Tuesday, in a half-lit apartment where I was testing a new code build for the 5th time, my fingers numb from the cold draft slipping through the window I couldn't afford to fix. It was a modular endpoint security system with adaptive threat response and a user dashboard built for actual humans instead of IT departments. Simple on the surface, but under the hood, it was a beast: real-time risk flagging, encryption that didn't choke bandwidth, and machine learning that didn't just pretend to understand the patterns. I launched it quietly, updated the landing page, pinged my mailing list, and went to bed unsure whether I'd just wasted 3 months of my life or cracked the thing that would finally get someone to take me seriously. By Friday, my inbox looked different. A regional health network, small clinics, urgent care centers, the kind of places with 2-person IT teams and outdated routers, asked for a demo. I didn't breathe until the call ended, and even then, I only exhaled when they said, "When can we start?" That contract paid more in 1 month than I'd made in the previous 6, and it didn't stop there. Word spread. Clinics talked to dentists, talked to therapists. One chain led to another. I was onboarding so fast I had to bring in help, part-time at first, then full. My calendar was a blur of deployments, support calls, onboarding meetings, and invoices that no longer bounced. The site traffic tripled. My churn rate dropped to near zero. I got invited to speak on a panel about cybersecurity for underserved sectors, and for once, I didn't feel like an imposter in a borrowed blazer. I upgraded my equipment, signed a lease on a real office space, still scrappy, still second-floor walk-up over a pawn shop, but it had glass walls and functioning AC and enough outlets for everything. The local paper ran a feature on the company, called it "The Rising Cybersecurity Startup Bridging the Tech Divide for Small Businesses," and used a photo of me at my desk that made me look way more confident than I felt that day. My first employee framed the article. I didn't ask him to. He just did it. But none of that mattered at home. My mom saw the article and called to ask if I was still planning to get a real job someday. My dad, when I mentioned the new contracts, just said, "It's good you're keeping busy." Amanda sent a thumbs-up emoji and then texted again 5 minutes later to ask if I could review her friend's husband's resume. because he was thinking about pivoting into tech. That was it. No excitement. No curiosity. Just that same flat wall I'd been hitting my whole life. Indifference disguised as concern. Dismissal wrapped in politeness. To them, it was still a hobby. A phase with better packaging. Something they assumed would eventually wind down, settle into something safe, respectable, manageable. But I didn't correct them anymore. I let them believe what they wanted to believe, because I was too busy answering calls from clients who trusted me, building systems that actually protected people, hiring my second employee, and watching the thing they dismissed as a toy evolve into something real enough to scare even me. I had a company. I had traction. I had proof. But more than that, I had momentum, and not even their silence could slow it down. He told me it was a dinner, just a simple dinner at the house. Nothing formal, just some family time, because we haven't caught up in a while. Which was suspicious on its own since my father never casually invited me to anything unless Amanda was involved or he had something strategic to unveil. But I showed up anyway, trying to keep an open mind, trying to believe maybe, just maybe. This was his clumsy way of acknowledging that I'd built something he couldn't ignore. I should have known the moment I walked in and saw the setup. The dining table was cleared of its usual centerpiece and instead replaced with a laptop, a projector, and a stack of folders that had my name printed across the top in bold. There were 3 men I'd never seen before, all in their 60s, all in muted blazers, seated with bottled water and notepads like they were prepping for a quarterly earnings report. My dad stood at the head of the table, hands clasped like a CEO addressing a nervous board. Amanda wasn't even there, just these strangers and my mother, who was already pouring wine like she knew I'd need it. I didn't sit. I stood there, backpack still slung over one shoulder, watching as one of the men nodded and said, "Vanessa, we've heard a lot about you. We're here to help you evaluate your options." Another one offered a weak smile and added, "We're just here to provide some perspective. Entrepreneurship is exciting, but it's also risky." I looked at my dad, who had already opened his laptop and was clicking through a PowerPoint titled, "I kid you not, the reality of startup failure, national data and financial implications." Slide 1 was a pie chart. Slide 2 was a bar graph. Slide 3 was a quote about how only 1 in 10 startups survives past 5 years. It wasn't until he introduced one of the men as a longtime friend from JP Morgan, who's kindly agreed to do a preliminary evaluation of your assets, that I realized what was happening. My mouth went dry. I turned to him slowly, still standing, still too stunned to even sit, and said the only thing that made sense in that moment. "Did you organize an intervention for me?" No one answered. My mother looked down into her wine glass. The men looked at each other like they'd missed a memo. My father had the nerve to look surprised, like I was the one being irrational. "Vanessa," he said, "we just want what's best for you. It's not too late to pivot. We've all made mistakes in our 20s. These gentlemen are here to help you think realistically about your future." He said it with that tone he used when Amanda brought home a B+, and he wanted to say he was disappointed without saying the word out loud. I laughed. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of it had broken something in me I didn't even realize was holding together. I looked around that table, at those men with their resumes and spreadsheets and metrics, and I felt this surreal sense of detachment, like I'd been dropped into someone else's bad corporate dream. They didn't see me. They never had. Not when I was coding at 14. Not when I launched NextLayer. Not when I signed contracts that paid for 3 people's salaries. And they didn't see me now, standing in their perfect dining room in shoes I'd bought with money they never thought I'd make on my own, being told my success was a phase, and my company a mistake I just hadn't admitted to yet. I didn't scream. I didn't storm out. I just looked at them all, shook my head once, and said, "I don't need rescuing." Then I turned around and walked out, their PowerPoint still glowing on the wall behind me. I don't remember closing the door. I just remember the sound of my own footsteps on their driveway and the quiet, burning rage in my chest that made me swear I'd never let them forget the moment they tried to hold a funeral for a company that wasn't even done growing. I was already halfway to the door, still stunned that my father had orchestrated a full-blown financial intervention with spreadsheets and investment bankers like I was some lost cause in need of corporate rehab, when Amanda, silent until then, looked up from her phone with a face I'd only ever seen when she discovered someone she considered beneath her had outpaced her. She blinked, tilted the screen toward herself again as if to double-check, then said it, loud, clear, completely unplanned. "Wait, your face is in Forbes." The room paused like someone had hit mute. My dad stopped mid-sentence. The 3 suited men looked confused, suddenly unsure whether they were here to fix a problem or shake hands with a success story. Amanda kept staring at her phone, her voice a little higher now, almost incredulous. "You're on the list. The Forbes list." Most influential women in technology, Vanessa Brooks. It says here next layer is valued at $18 million. For a second, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. I hadn't. I knew the article was going live sometime that week, but I hadn't told anyone, not because I didn't think it mattered, but because it didn't matter to them. Not until now. My mother's voice cut through the silence, soft, like she was afraid the number itself might be too loud. 18 million, she said, barely above a whisper, her wine glass still half-raised like she'd frozen mid-sip. She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at the table, at the floor, at nothing. My father's face didn't move at first. His hands dropped to his sides, and for a moment, he looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. No clever remarks. No slides. No talk of pivoting. Just silence. I looked around the room. The same room where I'd been told I was chasing a phase, where they tried to dissect my ambition like a tumor, and I felt every exhausted hour crash into me all at once. I felt the cold, the hunger, the stress, the years of being ignored, patronized, undermined. I looked directly at my father, then at my mother, and finally said the thing I'd been waiting to say since the day I coded my first line and no one thought to ask what I was building. Yes, I said, and you never asked how I was doing. Opening the Toronto office didn't feel like a victory parade. It felt like triumph, like trying to hold onto the wheel of something growing faster than I could steer it, and somehow keeping it from flying apart. We'd gone from 3 people working elbow to elbow in a loft with bad wiring to a 90-person operation spread across 2 countries, with internal departments, weekly syncs, HR guidelines, and people who now referred to me as the founder instead of just Vanessa. There were payroll deadlines, investor calls, partnership agreements being drafted by lawyers who spoke in a language I was still learning to decode, and a calendar that booked itself weeks in advance whether I liked it or not. And in the middle of it all, there was me. Still working too late, still missing meals, still waking up in a cold sweat wondering if one system breach would undo everything. The Forbes piece made us visible. It didn't fix anything, but it changed the tone. Suddenly people who used to second-guess my decisions now wanted to take me to lunch to pick my brain. And the same industry execs who once ignored my emails now slid into my DMs with thinly veiled interest. My inbox was a daily avalanche of speaking invites, partnership pitches, and offers from people who were suddenly very invested in supporting women in tech. But the strangest shift came from my family, not all at once, but in awkward increments. Amanda started texting questions like, "How do you land the clinic contract? And what CRM platform are you using now?" My mother asked if I could explain what a firewall actually does. And my father, who had once built an entire presentation on why I was destined to fail, began sending me articles about venture capital trends and typing comments under my LinkedIn posts that always ended with a clapping emoji. It was surreal. The cybersecurity conference was in Boston. I'd been asked to give the keynote, a 20-minute talk on closing the digital gap for small businesses, complete with slides, statistics, and AQ and a panel afterward. I'd given talks before, mostly virtual, sometimes on panels, but this was different. This was big. The kind of crowd that included actual press, actual competitors, actual analysts taking notes. I wore black because it felt sharp and unbothered, and I stood on that stage under glaring white lights with my hands not shaking and my voice not cracking, and I told a room full of people what it meant to build something from nothing, not because it looked good on a pitch deck, but because no one else was doing it, and someone had to. I didn't know they were coming. My parents. I didn't invite them. I didn't expect them to be there. But when I stepped off that stage, adrenaline still buzzing through my spine, I saw them near the back. My mother in a gray coat she wore for important occasions. My father standing next to her with that stiff, unreadable look he always got when he didn't know whether to feel impressed or threatened. They waited until the crowd thinned. My mom hugged me, said something soft about how she finally understood what I did, though I'm not sure she did, not really. And my dad, still standing just slightly apart like he didn't want to make a scene, said it. Just 3 words, quiet, almost like he was testing them. "I'm proud of you." It didn't land like a movie moment. There was no swelling music, no tearful embrace. It just settled there, awkward and late and a little heavy, like a package left on the wrong doorstep. But I nodded, and he nodded back, and that was the most honest conversation we'd had in years. He didn't apologize. He didn't have to. I wasn't waiting for it anymore. The shift didn't happen in some single, sweeping moment. It happened gradually, like the slow unfreezing of something that had been stiff and brittle for years. My family, once so tightly wound around their ideas of what success looked like, had started loosening their grip without really realizing it. The tension that used to fill every room we shared was still there, but softer, thinner, like a thread that finally learned to bend without snapping. Amanda, of all people, was the first to move from observer to participant. She came to one of our off-site team retreats, just to see how things run, she said. But within a week, she was asking questions about operations flow, catching things I'd missed, pointing out redundancies in the onboarding pipeline. 2 months later, she came to my office with a resignation letter from her law firm and a proposal to join NextLayer as COO. I said yes. Working with her wasn't always easy. She was sharp, efficient, direct in a way that clashed with my more chaotic style, but she knew how to get things done. She knew how to protect my time, challenge my assumptions, and keep the wheels moving while I focused on building the next version of what we could be. And in the quiet moments, between meetings, in the car on the way back from a client pitch, in the hotel bar after a long conference day, we talked like sisters again. Not rivals, not opposites, just two women learning to coexist outside the rigid roles we'd grown up in. My mom started sending me articles, clippings from local papers, links to interviews with female founders, long-winded emails about women breaking into male-dominated industries. She never said, "I'm proud of you," not in those words, but she said it in the way she chose her articles carefully, in the way she'd write. "This reminded me of you," or "They should have included your name." I think that was her version of rewriting the past, slowly, digitally, in subject lines and forwarded links. But the moment that stuck with me came one Sunday afternoon, months after the conference, after Toronto, after the company had grown into something none of us could pretend was small. I was home for dinner, sitting at the kitchen table while my dad poured coffee into chipped mugs he still refused to replace. He was quieter than usual, more thoughtful. Then, without looking at me, he said, "I once dreamed of starting a business myself, you know. I had the idea. I even had the plan. But I was afraid. Afraid of what I'd lose. Afraid of what people would say. Afraid of what it would mean if I failed." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, because anything more would have made the moment too heavy for him to carry. He looked up and gave a small smile. "Watching you do it, watching you risk everything, I think it helped me let go of some of that. I don't say this enough, but I'm glad you didn't listen to me." And that was when I realized that this journey, for all the years I'd spent believing I was on it alone, had done more than just change my life. It had cracked something open in all of them. Amanda had rediscovered a side of herself that didn't need to prove anything. My mom had begun to see possibility in places she once only saw risk. And my dad, who had spent a lifetime managing fear behind numbers and titles, had finally admitted the one thing he'd always tried to hide, that he'd been afraid to chase something of his own. And somehow, in chasing mine, I gave them permission to ask what else might be possible. But that's my story. What about yours? Have you ever felt dismissed for taking a path no one else understood? Have you ever had to prove that something real was growing beneath the surface while everyone else called it a phase? I want to hear it. Your turning points, your struggles, your quiet wins that no one clapped for. Drop it below. Let's talk.